Hi, in this video, I'm going to show you this automatic invoice parser that takes your invoices that you might receive as images, PDF files, and turns those into structured data in your database. So let me show you a quick demo of how this works. So first, let me open up an invoice here. So you can see here's an invoice. It has an invoice number, a date, a due date, a lot of other information, but I'm only interested in these three here. And I also want the name of the vendor, and then I also want the total amount here. So how we're going to extract that? First, let's go over to my Google Drive, and here is where I'm going to drop the invoice. And after that, I'm going to go over to my Airtable, and it's going to pop up here. So let's go back to the Google Drive now, and I'm just going to drop this invoice here, like so. That's all I have to do. Now, if I go back to n8n, here in 1 minute, it's going to execute this workflow automatically. If we open up this node here, you see that we set it to poll every minute, which is the smallest interval. You can't choose anything smaller than 1 minute, so we're going to have to wait for a while. Oh, now 1 minute has passed, and to see the execution, we're going to have to click on this execution tab here, and you can see this execution up here. So let's click on that, and we can see here that it executed successfully. If we go back to our Airtable, you can now see that we have a new row here with the invoice number, the invoice date, due date, and the invoice total, and that is the same invoice that I showed you before. This exact invoice now, the data here has been stored in our Airtable fully automatically by just dropping the invoice into a Google Drive. So let's go back to n8n, and let me now show you how to build this step by step. So we're going to start by creating a new workflow, and here we're going to set up our first trigger. So we're going to search for Drive here and select Google Drive, and here we have on changes involving a specific folder. Let's click on that, and here we get our first trigger. So first thing first is that you're going to have to set up your credentials if you haven't done that. I already have my credentials set up here. I have a video on how to set up Google Sheets. I will link to that in the description below. It is the same process here with Google Drive. You only have to, whenever I mention Google Sheets, replace that with Google Drive. So enable Google Drive instead of Google Sheets. And when you set the scopes for Google Sheets, you just set the scopes for Google Drive. And the rest is basically all the same. Okay, and now we're going to set the pull times. The pull time here is how often this n8n automation should check and pull our Google Drive and look for new invoices. The lowest interval you can set here is 1 minute every minute, so I'm going to leave that at every minute. And when do we want this workflow to trigger? We want it to trigger when changes involving a specific folder that we're going to select. And the folder here, you can select it here from a list by URL or by ID. So first, let's go and create the folder. So I'm going to go over to my Google Drive here, and I'm going to right click and click on new folder here. And I'm going to call this invoices. You can call it anything, doesn't really matter. Click on create. So now when I've created the folder, if you go back to n8n, it should now be able to find the folder from the list here. So if you click on select folder here, you see that we have invoices. So let's click on that. And then watch for, we want to watch for file created. So it's basically the same when you drop a file into the drive or you create a file in the drive. It is the file created here that we're going to watch for. Now let's test this by adding an invoice to Google Drive. So I'm going to go over to my Google Drive here, and I'm going to drop this invoice in here, like so. Let's go back here and click on Fetch Test Event. And you see that it fetched the invoice for us, or the data of the invoice. Now we want to download the invoice, the next step here. So to do that, let's click on this plus sign and add a new node. I'm going to search for Drive again. Click on Google Drive, and this time we're gonna do a download, that download file action. And the same here, we use the same credentials here for account, and resource is gonna be file, operation download, and here we're gonna select by ID. And then we're gonna go over here and find the ID of the file down here and drag this over here. And now click on test step, and should now download the file for us. Let's view it, and you see we get the invoice here. Now that we got our invoice here, it is time to parse the invoice, and that we're going to do with an API, a free online API called OCR.space. So let's go over to the website. It's OCR.space, and here we're going to click on free OCR API, And here is documentation, and we're going to need a free API key. So you can register for that by clicking on this link. It's very simple. You just enter your email address here. You don't even have to enter these things, and then subscribe, and they will send you an email message, and you'll find your API key there. So you copy that, and then go back here. And here we're now gonna create a HTTP request node. And if we go back to the API, you see there's an endpoint here, the default endpoint, which is this endpoint here, api.ocr.space/parse/image, and it's a post request, as you can see here. So let's go back to the HTTP request node and change this to post. And then we're going to enter HTTPS api.ocr.space/parse/image. And for authentication, we're going to select generic credential type. And here we have different types. We're going to select header auth here. We're going to set the API key in the header. And I have already set mine here. But what you would do is you just come in here and you type API key exactly like this. This is the name. And then you will paste in the API key you received by email in here. And that's it. And yeah, that's basically all we have to do now. Yeah, forgot about it. One more thing, of course, is the body. We're going to send the file, of course, to the API as the body that is going to be parsed. So we're going to toggle this here. And the body content type here is going to be form data. Or no, it's going to be n8n binary file actually. And here, input data field name. You take this name over here, which is data, like so. And then we test the step. Or the file extension is incorrect. Okay, let's see here. Options. Okay, I think we need to set this as form data actually. n8n binary file here. And then we input data there, and let's test this. And now it works. Yeah, so you have to set the body content type here as form data, not as binary file. And then you select the parameter type here as n8n binary file and set the input data field name as data. Okay, you can see now we got our parsed invoice here in text. This is our parsed invoice. You can have a look at it here in table maybe. No, you can have a look at it here in the JSON format. It's a little bit more clear here. Okay, so now the next step is we want to just make it a little bit cleaner with the set node, extract it with the set node. Let's click on schema here and drag the parse text. Where is it? It is here. Drag it over here and give it another name. Let's call it invoice data, something like that. Just gonna rename it set invoice data or extract get invoice data. Get invoice data like that. Now it's time to parse the invoice data with AI. So let's click on this plus sign here and search for LLM chain. Click on basic LLM chain. And here we're going to select define below because we're going to define our prompt here ourselves. And we're going to say you are a helpful assistant that extracts invoice details. Here is the invoice text, and here we're going to delimit the text by some XML. So it's invoice text, and then first slash to indicate the ending, invoice text, or the closing tag, not the ending, but indicate that it's a closing tag, and this is the opening tag. And in between here, we're going to add our invoice text. So let's see if we can drag it. We can't really drag it, so we're going to input this manually. Double curly brackets, JSON and then it's invoice data, double curly brackets, click on expression, you can see that it is extracted correctly, and then we're also going to tell it how to return the output, what to return to us. So return structured JSON data, including following keys. And now we're going to tell it what data to return to us, and select that. Let's go and have a look at our invoice here. So I want the invoice number, I want the date, I'm going to call this invoice date, the due date, I want the vendor name, and I also want the total amount here, so the invoice total. Let's go back here and say invoice date, and then I want due date, and we want, let's have a look at this again, date, due date, invoice number first, forgot about that, invoice number, invoice date, due date, vendor name, and I also want invoice total, Okay, let's test this and see what we get. Yeah, of course, we need to add a model here, so search for OpenAI, click on that. I'm going to use GPT-4o Mini, and for the account here, I also already have my credentials configured. To configure credentials, you can have a look at the docs here. It's very straightforward. Now let's try and test this again. And you can look, if you look at the output here, you see that it's not really in a great format to work with. So for that reason, we're going to need to add a output parser. So click on require specific output format here, toggle this. And here we're going to add a output parser to make sure that we always get the output in the same predictable format that we can work with. And we're going to select structured output parser here. And here we're going to enter our schema. So we're going to start by adding an object, give it a title, I'm going to call it invoice, type, get the colon here between the key and the value, and the type is going to be object, and then we're going to set some properties, create an object here, and the first property, let's go back first and see here what we have. We want to set all of these here, so I'm going to just copy these temporarily so I remember them. Go back here, paste them at the bottom. So the first one is invoice number. It's the invoice number. It's going to be an object. And here we're going to define the invoice number, like the format of the invoice number. So its type is going to be a string. And we're going to describe what it is. So description, the invoice number, like that. And the next one is invoice date. So let's do invoice date. An object for that as well. And the type is going to be string, description, the invoice date, and then we have due date, due date, object type. This is also a string. Not forget the quotes here. And description would be the due date of the invoice. And then we have the vendor name, also string. So it's a type, string, and description will be the vendor name, the name of the vendor who sent invoice. And then finally we have our last property here, which is invoice total. Invoice total type. This should be a number. Description. Let us say the total dollar amount of the invoice. All right, and then we also want to set all of these as required, so cut them out. And let's see here, let's collapse this, and here we're gonna set this here required, colon, add a list, and we're gonna paste these in here. So now all of these will be required. Okay, now let's try and run this again. So we don't have to rerun all of this, I'm gonna pin all of these. I just click on a P. You can right click also and pin here. So I'm gonna pin the data, and I'm gonna test the workflow. Okay, we got an error here. So let's open this up and have a look. It says model output doesn't fit the required format. So let's go to the structure output. And yeah, it seems that we selected the wrong thing here. So we selected generate from JSON example, which is when you want to generate the schema from an example JSON output that you want. That's not the case here. We want to actually define the schema, which we have already done here. So for that reason, we're going to select define below. But before that, let's copy this so it doesn't disappear. Click on copy and select define below. Delete this and paste this in here. And now it should work. So let's try this again. And it worked. Let's have a look at the output. And we got invoice number, invoice date, due date, vendor name, invoice total. Everything looks perfect. Now the last step is to connect this to Airtable and store the data there. So let's go out here, click here, search for Airtable, and the action is going to be create a record. You're going to need to set up an access token here. If you don't know how to do that, there is a video in the description below that shows you how to do it step by step. And for the resource, we're going to have a record, and our process is going to be create. And we're going to choose our base. I already have one created here. You see I have one base here and a table. I have a table and a base here. So let's go back and choose that from a list. I choose my base, and then I'm also going to choose my table from a list. I call my invoices, so that's the one there. And then it's going to fetch all the different column names here for us. If we go back, here, I'm gonna show you, this is just a normal string here. Click on edit field, this is just a vendor single text. The vendor here is just a single text string. Invoice number here is just a number. and invoice date is an ISO date format of type ISO, and the due date is the same here. It's also a date format type ISO there, and the invoice total is a currency format here. So that's it. So you can just set this up. The names doesn't really matter because we're gonna map them manually. Now let's go back here. You see here for the vendor, we're gonna drag this variable here, vendor name, like so. Invoice number, we're gonna drag the invoice number, and then we have the invoice date, we're gonna drag that in here. The due date, we're gonna drag that in there, and then we have the invoice total, we're gonna drag that down there. And for options, we're gonna have to set typecast and toggle this. This is for casting the date format correctly, otherwise the date format is gonna cause issues. Okay, now let's test this step. And let's go over to Airtable. You can see now that we got everything here. So we got the vendor name, the invoice number, the invoice date, the due date, and the invoice total. So now let's test this again with the new invoice. So let's unpin all of these. Click on save here. Let's activate this. Got it. Let's go over to invoices and let's try with the new invoice. I'm gonna drag 3159 here. We haven't tested that one. Let's go back to the workflow. Now I'm gonna fast forward the video. Okay, so I'm back here 1 minute later now, and you see that the workflow is running in the background. It just finished. So let's go back to Airtable, and we now got the second invoice here. It was added here automatically. So from now on, whenever we add an invoice, as long as the workflow is active, in 1 minute, it will parse the invoice and add that to our Airtable. So that's it for this tutorial. I hope you find this valuable. If you did, please subscribe and like. And if you'd like to get this template, you will find a link to it in the description below. And until next time, take care.